Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So, thank you. We are getting at this point to the conclusion of the actual flood itself, right? And here in chapter 8, we start reading about how the flood starts to subside. It's a very beautiful statement. Vayiskor Elohim et Noach. God remembered, took him to mind. He remembered Noah, ve'et kol hachaya, and all the animals, ve'et kol habeimah, and all the domestic animals, asher ito b'teva, which were with him in the ark. Vaya'aver Elohim ruach al haaretz, and God caused to pass a wind over the earth. Vayashoku hamayim, and the waters were assuaged. Well, I have to say that the thought that a wind was actually going to sort of calm down the waters was a hard thing for me to imagine. But as you will see, for the Yashoku has more to do with the temperature of the water dropping, just like you'll blow on a burn or something to cool it off. And that's kind of what the Vayashoku Hamayim means, and the waters cooled off. But let's take a look. We'll look at a deeper point here. Here we are. Vayashoku hamayim. Amar Rav Chisda, said Rav Chisda, Dor hamatbul berotchin kilkalu, that we discussed this, of course, yesterday, that they messed up in boiling water, referring, of course, to the sexual exploits. Uverotchin nidonu, and so they were judged with boiling water. Berotchin kilkalu, he says, ba'avera, right? Through through transgression, vortchin nidonu, and through boiling they were judged. Ketiv hacha, how do we know there was boiling? Ketiv hacha v'yashoku hamayim, here it states, and the waters, they had this word v'yashoku, and we have this word in a different context, which clarifies what that meaning of v'yashoku is. It says there in the book of Esther, chapter 7, v'chamat hamelech shak. I think it's shachecha, something like that, or shachecha. It could be in pause, so meaning that the anger of the king was assuaged. So that's how we know. I mean, and very often the way we learn the meaning of words has to do with its context, and that's the context here. And we did this yesterday, and then we got started on the Torah Temimah, and we got to a verse from Job, and I wasn't willing to try and translate that at sight. I needed to go back and look at a translation of that passage. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of where we started. We didn't get that far. I think Stam Chema Rotachati. He says that in general, when we talk about anger, we talk about it boiling, right? It's a legitimate word to refer to, and that's how we know, that the anger of the king was assuaged in that context. V'chidichtiv, and here we go. It says elsewhere, v'chamato ba'erabo or ba'arabo, and his anger burned within him. And we know chema means angry, and here we have this word burning, right? So we're talking about heat, boiling, etc. I mean, it puts us into the right context. For Afkan, and so here too, Dichtiv Vayashoku, where it talks about they were assuaged mash mashayurchim. So the implication is if they cooled down, right? If they cooled down, the implication is that they were boiling to begin with. So over Yerushalmi, he says, but it's interesting that in the Yerushalmi Talmud, Perek Chelek, in the chapter, this is the Sanhedrin of the Yerushalmi Talmud, not the Babylonian Talmud, in this chapter called Chelek, Uva Midrash Rabbah, and in the Midrash Rabbah, quite possibly here, Midrash Rabbah, I'm going to guess that it's referring to the Midrash Rabbah on our verse here. Yalfi, they learn out, Shahayu Hamayim Rotchim, they learn out that the waters were boiling, Mipasuk Te'iyov. They don't learn it from this verse, they learn it from a verse in Job, and this is where we broke down, or I broke down, chapter 6, right? Here's the verse, by the way. Ba'et Yizravu Nitzmetu, Bechamo Nidaku Mimkumam. when they are consumed at the time, right, Ba'et, Yizravu nitzmatu. So nitzmatu is they are consumed, right? Uh, they are b'chamo, that's his wrath, right? Nid'aku mimkomam. They are torn away from their place, right? So, uh, but eight Yizravu, there's some, it feels like Yizravu isn't being translated here, right? So it could be, it could be that it has something to do. I don't feel this verse is translating the word Yizravu because Nitzma too would be consumed and Chamo would be his wrath. So something, unless Yizravu means the same as consumed, something like that. But the point is, we are looking at this is a continuation, right? That's a quote of the verse, but the Talmud Yerushalmi goes on to say, "Al tikra bechomo," right? This is bechomo. Do not write in his anger, ela bechamimo. So this is a device that's used in rabbinic literature occasionally, where they'll take a word, a verse, and a word in a verse, and they will alter it just slightly to change the meaning. So chamimo means in his heat, in his heat. So v'chola pasha, and he mentions as tangentially. Torah Temimah mentions tangentially. V'chola pasha he nidreshet al inyan hamabul. He says that whole chapter is understood. It's explained regarding that it refers to the flood, the Mabul, Noah's flood. Yehuyanshan. He says, check out both in the Talmud Yerushalmi and also, I believe, in the Midrash Rabbah. They take those verses from Job and show how they apply to the situation of the flood. But there's a question now. He says, wait a second. Why does the Talmud Yerushalmi? Why does the Yerushalmi Talmud take a different verse? Why does it learn the same? It's learning the same issue, the same lesson about the waters boiling, right? And it's learning it from a different verse, a verse from Job. Why does it learn it right from here in the Torah? The Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud learns it from there. So he says, Yesh lomar, one can say, Sheleshitatam Azle, that the Jerusalem Talmud is following its particular take on their interpretation of the flood here. And we're going to find out. There's a difference between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli, how to interpret the nature of those waters of the flood going on. The Sphira lay, because they hold, in the Jerusalem Talmud, they hold, the hamayim hayordim milamala hayurodchim, that only the waters that came down from the heavens, they were boiling. Velo, but not me hatahom, but not the waters that were coming up from the depths. Remember, we read back in the previous chapter, how the waters came down, the windows of heaven were opened, but also the gates of the deep were also opened. The water came from both places. So according to the Yerushalmi, the waters that were raining down were boiling, but the waters that were coming up were coming up from the depths of the earth, they weren't boiling. V'zeh mochach rak mipasuk de'iyov. And you can only prove that from the verse from Iyov, from Job, dichtiv be, because it says, nid aku mim komam, right? They were, I guess we'd say, moved away from their place. Aval Bavli, but in the Babylonian Talmud, Sphira Laho, they hold, Ta'amayim Hatachtonim Ne'esu Rodchim. They hold that the waters below that were bubbling up from the bottom were also were boiling. And that we can infer from the verse that we have in front of us. Now, I'm not entirely satisfied here, and I want to go back and look at those verses a little more closely and see how he is getting that. Okay. So let's see. Okay. So chamimo, right? His heat. Nidaku b'chomam. Oh, okay. I think, okay, the word Yizravu is the word that tells us uh, raining down. That's the word that the Yerushalmi is saying refers to the waters, and that's the Yizravu. I am going to somewhat, hopefully, educationally guess that that's what it is. Whereas, let's take a look at it. Uh, and here, okay, whereas Vayashoku Hamayim refers to, let's make sure we got it, okay. Kol HaBehema, okay. Yeah, okay, here we go. That this wind was on the land. And because it says the wind was on the land, the implication is that the waters that had come up to the land were the boiling waters, because it's Vayashoku Hamayim. So that's as close as I can get right now to understanding how this proof works and the point that the Torah Temimah is making here. All right. So unless you have a question, I will go on. Lots of Rashi, as you can see. So eventually, of course, things start calming down, and the ark rests. I believe here we tell, right. It rests on the Mount Ararat, etc., and the waters keep going and diminishing, etc., etc. And then it says he sent the Orave. He sent the raven to begin with, right? I mean, everyone knows about the dove, but in this particular case, to begin with, Noah sent the raven, and the raven went and never returned, right? It never came back. So here we go. Vayishlach et ha'orev. So Noah sent the raven, the crow, the raven. Amar Reish Lakish said, Tshuva nitzachat heshivo orev leNoach. He says that the raven had a compelling argument with Noah. He made an argument. He had a debate with Noah, this raven, and he made a compelling point. Amarlo, what was this compelling point? Remember, we are looking this as literature. That's these kinds of interpretations that we're dealing with right now, where you have an animal talking to Noah, is from a literary point of view, right? I don't think Reish Lakish is trying to suggest that the crow or the raven actually opened up its mouth and spoke to Noah, but it's discussing it from a point of view as if the raven could have said something. So, Amarlo, he said to him, Rabcha sonani, your master hates me, referring to God. Your master means God's, God. Your master hates me. Va'ata snaetani, and you hate me. You hate me. In other words, you're asking me to go on this mission, and yet you really hate me. That's why you're asking me to go on it. How do I know this? Rabcha son ani. How do I know that your master hates me? She'amar min hatohorim shiv'a, or min hatmeimim shnayim. Your master hates me because he said, from the pure birds take 7, but from the impure birds take only 2, or from the impure animals, not just birds. And the crow is an impure animal. It's an impure bird. So there would only be the crow and its mate. That's the only one, as opposed to doves, which are kosher birds. So there would have been 7 doves, right? So there are only 2 of us. Atasne tani, how do I know you hate me too? Clearly you hate me as well. Shata maniach lishloach mimin shiva, because you're setting aside the idea of sending one of the species that have 7 animals. V'sholech kamin shnaim, and you're sending from a species that only has 2, that's only a pair. V'im yifgabi sarchama, again, it's speaking in literary kinds of ways. This is the angel of the sun, something like that, should injure me, right, or should kill me, or Sar Sina, or the angel of cold, right? So, in other words, I think here it's talking about whether the angel of heat or the angel of cold should kill me. Nimsa, what's going to happen? Chaser ba'olam bria achat. A species is going to be missing from the world. That's the argument. So before we get into the Torah Temimah, when I read this, I thought, wow, here is the notion of extinction being brought in this material here, and how awful that kind of concept is. And I thought this was a beautiful little piece here discussing that particular issue. Well, the, the raven might have had a great argument, didn't stop Noah from sending him out. He did. Okay. But the point is, so Reish Lakish is trying to tell us something here. Exactly what Reish Lakish is trying to tell us, I'm not certain. I will have to meditate on that further. But we could say that Reish Lakish is raising the issue of extinction, and that it really is an important issue. And that, we know that crows are mentioned, ravens are mentioned later on, because the ravens, much later on, I believe it's in the book of Kings, the ravens bring food to Elijah. And so, in a sense, that's the reward that the ravens get for this. And what is Reish Lakish trying to tell us? And what is the Bible perhaps telling us about Dafka, a raven? They certainly are intelligent birds. We know that. We know that. By the way, I'm not even certain that ravens aren't capable of learning how to say certain words. I'm probably wrong. I'm just guessing here from some vague memory. But I do know they're very intelligent and they can be trained. But whether or not those are really issues that are germane to what we're discussing now, I'm not certain. Let's take a look at Torah Temimah. Lo nitpa'er bichlal me'ein drashze. He says, he doesn't get, in a sense, it's hard to figure out where on earth Reish Lakish got this particular interpretation. On what basis did he get this interpretation? But he's again, the Torah Temimah is asking it because he has some ideas. V'yitachen, it's possible, the Darish, that he is interpreting this out of halashon yatso v'shov milashon tshuva, because later on in the next verse it says that, and it uses the words yatso v'shov. It says that the raven went out and came back. In other words, went back and forth. That's what Yatzor B'Shov means. That the raven went back and forth. It didn't come back to the ark. It just went back and forth until things dried up, presumably. And he's saying that the word Vashov is related to the word Tshuva. V'chein meforash b'midrashim. And in fact, that is mentioned in the midrashim, where this comes from. There are parallel midrashim. V'yein mashikatuv, and he says there's some further investigation one can do. One can look into what besamuch pasuk yud aleph. When we look at verse 11, here we go, right? There's verse 11 we're going to talk about. Bidrasha alei zayit, that's what we're going to be looking at, right? That we're going to look at the verse about alei zayit, the leaves of an olive branch, etc. And so we're going to leave this for now, and we will work on this tomorrow. So a second. All right, one moment, and I will stop the share. Any comments before we go on to other things? Okay, I will stop the recording.